I think I'm safe in saying that everybody, or maybe if we don't want to go, all superlative, almost everybody, loves a last-minute save. Everybody loves that, right? In stories or in movies or on television shows, right? The hero comes in or the heroine comes in, right? Something has crashed in on them. They just look like they're dead. They're either knocked out. Maybe they are dead. Who knows, right? And then just as everything sounds or looks lost, all of a sudden that hero or that heroine resurrects up and saves the day, and everybody, woo, right? Everybody loves it. Everybody loves it when that kind of thing happens. The good guys always come out on top, right? Or maybe it's a war movie, and the battle is raging on, and the good guys, they're losing, they're retreating, they're falling back, and it just seems like the battle's going to be lost. And as the saying goes, the battle is lost. For the one to the battle, the war is lost, right? And it's just about to happen, and all of a sudden, the cavalry shows up, and boom, they win, and good guys win. It's great, love it. Love that kind of thing. The last minute save, that's nerve-wracking and exhilarating all at the same time, right? That's why we like it so much. This morning we're seeing a last minute save in our text. But I want us to notice that within this text we also have a man, not Jesus, a man, though, who displays goodness toward others. And we see this good focused really in two different ways. We see it in two different ways. But then we also actually see the same man putting on a different display. So he has two displays of goodness, but we see a different display. He is displaying also extreme faith, marvelous faith. So we see this goodness, right? The first good is a compassion for his slave. And then that second good, that's wrong. It should say compassion. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to the repeat. Let's put those up there. See if that says it. Nope. Keep going to the next one. Go after the text. I changed it, not for Matt's sake, but because it just really didn't work. So we'll do that one. Compassion toward his slave. And then there's also a love towards the nation, because it really is a love towards this nation. It actually explicitly says there's this love towards this nation, and then obviously there's going to be a faith toward Jesus. So there's the compassion of the slave, there's a love towards the nation, and then there's faith towards Jesus. And if you will, please stand with me for the honor of the reading of God's word. We're going to read 10 verses here this morning, 11. Starting at verse 1 going until verse 10. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. And when the centurion heard that about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." And Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at them. And turning to the crowd that followed him, said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Thank you. You may be seated. So what we see again, compassion towards the slave, love toward the nation, faith toward Jesus. And this first display of goodness, this first display of good comes in the display of compassion directed toward the slave of the centurion. Jesus had finished his teaching. He's left the step that he had been preaching from. And as he enters into Capernaum, He gets wind, somebody comes to him, some people come to him, some elders come to him to tell him about this centurion whose slave is sick. He's just minding his own business, doing his own thing, walks in, and then all of a sudden it happens. Now we need to understand, first off, that we not confuse elders of the Jews with Pharisees or with scribes or with Sadducees. They're not necessarily the same thing. The elders of the Jews would have been very prominent Jews. They would have been very prominent men within a community, but not necessarily were they scribes or Pharisees. They were men of influence. Pretty much they would make up what was called the synagogal government. In other words, they were in charge of the synagogue. What may be read, who may speak as a rabbi, that kind of thing. So these men were typically very influential men within the community, highly respected, but not necessarily, again, scribes or Pharisees or Sadducees, that kind of thing. They may be, but we shouldn't confuse them with them. They're not the same. And I think it's really important that we need to understand that this is happening in Capernaum. Remember, before we got into the Sermon on the Plain, we see that Jesus was in Nazareth. Remember that? And we look at Luke 4:23 and 24. He's there in Nazareth. He's at the synagogue proclaiming the word of God to them, and they reject it. And he said to them, "Doubtless you will quote me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well." This is one more thing that Jesus is doing within the town of Capernaum that ought to and should really make the people in Nazareth, those who had rejected him, jealous. They want him back, right? Because the prophet, he says, right? "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown." So Jesus has already performed a whole bunch of miracles within the town of Capernaum, and now Luke is saying he's back. He's not going back to Nazareth, but he is going back to Capernaum, and he is going to perform one of the greatest miracles of this time, as of yet. And the elders of the Nazarene synagogue rejected Jesus, but the elders of the Capernaum synagogue, they actually come to Jesus and look for him to come and do a miracle. And Luke tells us that they are coming to Jesus because there is this slave of a centurion who's on his deathbed. Again, not just any slave, but a highly valued slave. Highly valued to the centurion. And that may not seem like much at first, but it really is. Because this idea of being highly valued, this is not a utilitarian kind of idea. This is not about his usefulness, right? I find this slave to be very useful, and therefore he is highly valuable to me. That's not the case. That is not the way that this word is used. It's not a word that is often used within Scripture, but when it is used, it never means just simply a utilitarian type of high value. Let's go to a couple of places. It's not often. I think it might be 5, 6 places in the New Testament. But let's go and let's take a look. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. "As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious." He's precious. Precious. The word precious is that same word as highly valued. Even another place in Luke, he says this, Luke 14:8, he says, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him." That word distinguished, same word being used there. So if you're going to a party, you don't want to sit at the front because somebody that is closer, someone that means more, someone that is more honored, someone more distinguished, someone more highly valued, someone more precious than you might be there. That's what Jesus says. So this is not a utilitarian word. This is not simply a usefulness that this guy has developed some type of usefulness to the centurion and therefore he's highly valued. It's not that at all. It is his being. Does anybody watch the show Chosen? Okay. Have you gotten to the last couple of episodes for this season? I don't want to give a spoiler. Spoiler alert, put your fingers in your ear if you haven't gotten there. You see the centurion his servant is now sick, and you see that the servant is there lying in his bed, and he's dying. And it turns out that the centurion, that the slave is actually his son. his illegitimate son. That is not scriptural. Okay? Now, there is a reason maybe that they would bring that out and they would think that, because there actually is, when he says that if you will just say the word, you can heal my servant, that word for servant is different than general word for servant. Everywhere else, it's doulos, it's the slave, it's the servant. In this case, it's pais, right? Which simply just means boy or son. It can actually mean son. So they're actually pulling this one little obscure text and saying that, right? And saying, well, this might be his son. It could be, but probably not. But what it does show is that there is a value there. There is something, there is a heart for this servant, for this slave. This slave was precious to his master. And so therefore he was being honored by his master. And if you stop, that's just weird. Because we don't usually expect a slave to be honored by the master. It's the slave's job to honor the master, not the master's job to honor the slave. Jesus has just been speaking on doing good, right? And really doing good and he's now being confronted by this man who is actually showing that kind of goodness. The kind of goodness that honors his own slave. This slave has really no good that he can offer back. He is a slave. The best that he can do maybe is work hard for his master. That's it. It's not like he is ever going to have enough money that he is going to be able to throw a party and give honor to his master. It's not going to happen. Slaves were the lowest end of the Roman totem pole, right? There's the bottom part. There's nobody lower than the slave, and there are hierarchies of slavehood, but slave is like the lowest there is. He's a centurion. He's not the highest in the in the Roman Empire. Of course, that would be Caesar himself, the emperor himself. But he is a centurion. In other words, he has quite a bit of authority, and he actually seems to, as we look later in the text, that he actually seems to have quite a bit of money because he at least helped building of the majority of the synagogue. So he's not a slave, certainly not. He's got some authority. He's got quite a bit of authority. He's over this town. He's over 100 troops or so, hence centurion, right? And he's got some money. Here he is showing compassion to a slave who could never really pay him back. Showing goodness to this slave. Being honoring to this slave. Someone that was completely, absolutely beneath him. I had a friend. I won't mention his name. Not that he is probably watching, because I'm sure he isn't, but it's because I haven't been in touch with him for forever. But I had a friend when I was growing up, and he was very poor, extremely poor. Came from a broken home. He lived with his grandmother. Who had quite a bit of health problems. And I would go over to his house and we'd play, and he would come over to my house and we'd play. One of the times I got in a lot of trouble, was I didn't tell my mom where I was going. I just stayed on the bus until I got to his house, and then I never called until I was ready to get picked up, and she was having a fit. All right. So anyway, so I remember that distinctly. But anyway, we would go to each other's house. We'd play all the time. We had a great old time. And then about the time I was 12 or so, he actually moved to New Hampshire. Never heard from him again. He and his sister moved to New Hampshire. Never heard from him again. Until about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, he found me on Facebook. He sends me a message. Hey, is this Chris Hughes that used to live in Flovilla? I was like, yeah, that's me. And he said, he asked, how things were going, how the family was doing. And I told him how the family was doing, and I told him that my dad had passed away when I was 18. And he writes back, he responds back. He was so sad. He really was so sad to hear that my dad had died. He says, please thank your mom, because she treated me like family. She treated me like I was one of her own. Both your mom and dad treated me like I was their own child, right? And that just meant so much to him, to the point that he had to find me on Facebook and just let me know that. Haven't heard from him since. That was the last thing I heard from him. It was like 10 years ago, right? I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's why he says he's my boy, my child, my son. Not necessarily because it was his own, but because he loved him. He had such a compassion for him, such an outgoing spirit for him. Now let me ask you this. Is there someone in your life that you can show this kind of love toward? Because this is what Jesus is talking about. We saw it in the Sermon on the Plain, that he's talking about doing good to those who can do no good to you. He'll bring it up later, right? You invite those to the party that cannot reinforce that. I cannot invite you to a party because they just aren't able to. There's no financial means to do so. Is there someone in your life that you know that cannot repay you, but you can do good? Not simply just as a project. Well, I have an assignment now, God says, or Jesus, or, excuse me, I'm not God, nor am I Jesus, but I was going to say God says to do this, Jesus says to do this, Pastor Chris says I should do this from the pulpit, right? Not as a project, but as a person. Because your love is growing, both for God and for your fellow man. Is there somebody else? Somebody out there? It's not just though that the centurion was good to his slave, who could do really nothing for him. He also displayed a love for the people of Israel. So again, this is a centurion. It's a Roman official. He's a soldier. He really actually, in his position, he could have actually ordered the elders to go and talk to Jesus, and they would have had to go, no matter what, under the threat, really, of death. Disobeying a Roman soldier, disobeying a centurion, they had to go, could have been under threat. That's how it worked. But they don't go under threat. We see that they don't actually go under threat. Let's look at verses 3 through 5 here, because he says here, when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." You see that the elders actually pleaded with Jesus earnestly. The word could mean implore, but it basically means to plead. It's plead earnestly, plead with all of their might that Jesus would come and do this. It wasn't only clear that the centurion had a compassion for his servant, but the man also loved his community. There's no pretense on these people, in these elders. There's no pretense here. There's only earnestness. There's only a desire to see Jesus do this, because they look at him and they go, this man is actually worthy to have this done for him. It is evident that this man should have this done. The word is axios. Remember, axiomatic, it is self-evident. That's the word, that's the same word here, axios. It is self-evident. Everybody knows that this guy should have you do this miracle for him, because he is the one who built our synagogue. He loves our nation. Here is a Roman occupier who is actually seen as worthy by a Jewish eldership. That is unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. They were going to Jesus, asking Jesus, the Messiah, who, whether or not they believed he necessarily was the Messiah isn't even the issue. They knew that Jesus could do miracles. They knew that Jesus could do things that nobody else could do. And they're asking for a miracle, not on behalf of another Jew, but on behalf of a centurion, something that would make that centurion's life exponentially easier, because they found him worthy. He had a love for the nation. I mean, how good of a reputation must a guy acquire so that those who are supposed to be haters of any Roman occupier actually plead earnestly to have somebody do a miracle on their behalf? Anybody ever seen Schindler's List? I love Schindler's List. Schindler's List, amazing movie. Okay? The end of it always gets me. The waterworks, I get like allergy attacks so bad at the end of that movie, every single time, right? Because in the end, he doesn't feel like he's done enough, right? He's always like, this ring could have bought me another Jew. I could have sold this car. That's 3 Jews right there, kind of thing, right? And the Jews are like all standing there. And they're like, you did all that you could do. And they promised that if he was ever to be tried, that they would all stand there and give an account of how worthy he was to be released, right? That at the end of the movie, they see the actual Jews that he saved, the ones that were still living, going to his grave and placing the rock, as they do within the Jewish culture. They're placing the rock on his tomb or on his grave as a sign of honor and respect. He was technically a part of the Nazi crowd. He wore the badge. But he showed such love and such compassion. How good of a reputation must somebody have that those who are supposed to hate him actually love him? Back when I was a kid, I don't know why I keep telling these kid stories. When I was a kid, I used to watch a cartoon called The Flintstones. Anybody ever heard of The Flintstones? It's the first time that I had ever heard of Dr. Livingstone. You ever heard of Dr. Livingstone? It was in The Flintstones. Dr. Livingstone, I presume, because that's a famous saying. Dr. Livingstone, I presume, right? It was there. And so, if you don't know who Dr. Livingstone was, Dr. Livingstone was a missionary, but he was also an explorer. And he was actually also an activist. But he was a missionary. He was looking, he wanted to tell people about Jesus all over the world. He really wanted to, but he had a heart for Africa, so he would go into Africa. But there's also something else that he had a heart for. He had a heart to end the slave trade. Now, by this time, the slave trade in America had stopped, the slave trade in England had stopped, but there was still slave trade within the Arab world. And it was a huge thing. And so he wanted to stop it. And he believed that if he could find the source of the Nile, that it would garner enough attention the world over that he could shine a light on slave trade and how evil a thing it was. So that's why he actually wanted to be an explorer. So he's looking for the source of the Nile. If you don't know the source of the Nile, there's two sources to the Nile. There's the Blue Nile and there is the White Nile. I believe the Blue Nile was discovered a long time ago. But the white part of the Nile, whichever one, I could get it wrong. My mind slips right now. But the second source, that wasn't discovered until the late 1800s. He couldn't figure out where it was come from. That's what Dr. Livingstone was trying to do. He's trying to figure out where the source of the Nile came from so that it would garner enough attention that he could shine a light on the slave trade and stop it within the Arab world. He never found it. Couldn't find it. He had searched Africa over. He is the only one to have gone through the entire, all the way across the continent of Africa. He did it twice up until that point. He was the first one. First white man, certainly, to ever do it. And so, at one point in his life, he went missing. Nobody could find him. Nobody had heard from him. He hadn't sent any correspondence. Nobody knew where he was. They thought he was dead. Suddenly, he wasn't. They realized he wasn't. Henry Stanley found him. He was not great looking. He was hungry. He was thin, very thin. But Henry Stanley's the one who uttered those words. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? And it was. Soon after that, Dr. Livingstone, though he could not find the Nile, he actually wrote a paper. He wrote a report on the slave trade, specifically one particular incident. But he said that, and basically, it was not unique to this incident, but this was the incident that he was writing about, and so he sent it, and it got published in England, and it did shine a light. Even though he couldn't find the Nile, it shined a light on the slave trade. And just a couple of months after he had died, the king of Zanzibar ended the slave trade. It was the number one place where the slaves were. Ended it. Slaves were traded. Ended it. Would not allow it anymore. And since that was the number one place, it died everywhere else. Right? So, but why do I tell you this story? That's a great story, Chris. Get to the point. Let me tell you the point. Okay? Because a city was named after Livingstone. It's actually called Livingstone, and it's in Zambia. When the British colonized Africa, they did a horrible, horrible thing. They messed a lot. Many people were killed in the name of change and colonization. People of Africa, though, when they ended up getting their independence from England colonization, they changed every single one of their, just about, obviously there's Egypt and those kinds, but almost every single country changed its name to an African name. And every single city named after a white man was changed, except for one city, Livingstone, Zambia. They wanted to keep that name. Every single statue of a British colonizer was torn down and destroyed, except for the statues of Livingstone. Livingstone is the only white person, only European in Africa of the 19th century to be honored. The only one. They speak very highly of him. He won the hearts of the continent, the entire continent, because he gave them his own heart. Here are people who are supposed to hate Rome and hate any Roman that comes in. And yet they are earnestly pleading to Jesus to perform a miracle for this man because they looked at him and said, he is worthy to receive this miracle. He loved this community, and his love towards this community and this nation as a whole was extraordinary. Because those who were supposed to be, those who were supposed to be his enemies, and those who were supposed to see him as an enemy, saw him as a friend and worthy of Jesus' miracle. So again, Jesus just been speaking on loving those who are your enemies. And we see this example. Loving those who are your enemies, doing good to those who cannot do good to you, and both of them in this example of this centurion. God can give us some examples that are just out there. They're just weird, just things that we're not expecting, people that we are not expecting this example to come from. But as one commentator wrote, he says about this example, he says that even if Jews thought such a man worthy of help from Jesus, Jewish Christians should see no barriers to the acceptance of similar people into the church when he was referring to Acts chapter 10 with Cornelius, the centurion, coming into the church. They should have welcomed that because there is no longer hostility between Jew and Gentile when we're under Christ. But then lastly, we see this faith toward Jesus. There's compassion for the slave, there's love for the nation, but then there is faith toward Jesus. Before Jesus was even able to get to the centurion's house, he sent out some friends to stop him. Let's go, 6 through 8. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but say the word and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. So the centurion, he knows, I'm sure it seems evident that he knows that he has a love and respect from the Jewish community. He has shown them love, he has shown them respect, he has shown them compassion, and that kind of thing. He knows that he has earned, that they find him to be worthy, and yet when he is talking, he says, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to have someone like Jesus come under my roof. And that word that he uses for worthy, that's different. I told you axios, that was the word that the Jewish elders used. Different word here. There's a subtle difference, but there is really a difference here, right? So the people saw him as worthy. They saw him as good enough, self-evident that he has done enough, that he is worthy in order to have a miracle performed on his behalf. But when he considered himself, he realized that he really wasn't good enough. He wasn't important enough. He wasn't adequate enough to have someone like Jesus come under his roof. If you're the president of the United States, guess what? You do not go to anybody else's office. You don't get summoned to somebody else's office. You do not get the vice president to tell you, hey, president, why don't you come over to my office? We need to talk for a moment. That doesn't happen. You know why? Because that's beneath the dignity of the office. If you are the president of the United States, you summon people to your office. And they have to come. Here's a centurion who understands that fact. He knows that if he gets summoned to somebody that's higher over him, he better go. He does not get to go and talk to somebody over him and say, why don't you come over here and you talk to me? That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way at all, right? Nor would he go to somebody else's house, somebody else's place, somebody else's office and lower his dignity. He understands how the world works. He understands how authority works. And he also understands that just a word will do. That's all he needs from Jesus. He just needs a word. Just say the word. That's all he needs. One of the authority does not necessarily need to be present in order for that authority to take place. It can certainly, authority can take place through a proxy, whether that person is sending another person like the centurion has done, or he can send it in a piece of paper, an order on a piece of paper, and he gives it to whoever it is that needs to hear it, whoever needs to read it. His presence is not necessary in order for his authority to be active. Now, if we could just learn this lesson, how easy, how wonderful it would be. Because I do think that we would love to have Jesus here with us. We would love for Jesus to be present with us in bodily form. We'd love for him to be present in our homes when things are going wrong so that he can make things right. We want him to be here with us when trials are coming our way. But here's the thing. It is not the presence of Jesus' body that makes the difference, but the power of Jesus' word that really makes the difference. You see, we've been talking about the centurion this entire time. I say we. I've been talking about the centurion all the time. But the story is not about the centurion. The story is about Jesus. It really is about Jesus. The centurion understood Jesus more than the people of Israel did. He was the one that had authority. He understood what authority was about. And I know that we spent a bit of time, 9 weeks, right, when we were talking about, when we were out doing the Sermon on the Mount between the calling of the apostles and the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain. We spent about 9 weeks in. If you recall, we go back a little bit, you see that this idea of authority has come up over and over and over again. Who gives you the authority to heal on the Sabbath? Who gives you the authority to forgive sins? This is a theme within Luke, the authority of Jesus. And here is this man who is in authority, the centurion, who has authority, he understands authority, and he says, you have the authority. All you have to do is say the word. That's who Jesus is. It's all about Jesus. It's not really about the centurion. So he talks about Jesus. He points out who Jesus is. And if you remember Luke, remember the very beginning of Luke, he writes why he is writing. Who is he writing to? He's writing to a man named Theophilus. Why is he writing to Theophilus? So that Theophilus would have an accurate account, an orderly account of who Jesus is to confirm the things that he had heard. This is all about, this text, every single text in Luke is really about Jesus. To prove that Jesus is whom the Theophilus thought him to be and heard him to be. He says, you're the authority, Jesus. Just a word from you. Man who understood it, who had been trained by the greatest army of the day, who had lived under the authority and was in authority himself, saw that despite his position, he was unworthy to have Jesus come into his home. What does it say about Jesus' authority? What does it say about the estimation of Jesus' authority in his mind? That Jesus is a greater man than this man could ever be. And it was that revelation that caused him to keep Jesus from coming his way. It was that understanding that brought him to believe that Jesus not only needed to say the word and his servant would be healed, but he never needed to actually see him. Again, we go back and you look, I think it was, is it verse, where was it? Verse 3? When the centurion heard about Jesus, he had never actually seen Jesus. He had never heard directly a sermon from Jesus. He had never seen him perform a miracle. But he understood authority that he didn't need to have him present. And that is the faith that made Jesus marvel. It was marvelous faith. Marvelous faith. None of the Jews, none of the Gentiles got it. But this man did. Let's look at chapter 7, verse 9. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at them. And turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. Whether the faith was bigger, whether it was stronger, doesn't matter. We like to think of faith in that way. Bigger, stronger, weak, smaller, doesn't matter. The point is that faith was based on the understanding of who Jesus was. That's all that's necessary. Now, I wish I had the faith of this centurion. You certainly can. Because all he did was just reason. He said, Jesus has the authority. It's not about how big, how strong, or how weak, or how small. It is simply about, do you know who Jesus is? Do you trust him to be who he really is? So as we finish Luke 7, 1 through 10, we've seen that the centurion had a compassion for his slave and a love for the nation, but it was really about his faith in Jesus. Understanding who Jesus was. Faith not just in Jesus, but in Jesus' word. Just say the word. You may remember last week, as we finished up with the Sermon on the Plain, he asked the question, why do you say to me, Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? Centurion never saw Jesus, never heard from Jesus, only heard about Jesus. And yet to him, it's not about Lord, Lord, but it's about his word and the authority to do what he says and to believe exactly what he has said. It was enough. He trusted what he said. It's enough. Is it enough for you? In this life, when those you love are sick, when you pray and they aren't made well, or when you pray for those who are not yet converted and they're not repenting, when those of you who seek a miracle and yet have not yet received it, do you still trust in his authoritative word? When your son is struggling in his soul, when your daughter is rebelling from the faith, do you continue to trust? Some of you may not yet be believers. You think somehow you'll get by the judgment with your outward works, compassion and love and that kind of thing. But what we see in the story is that it was not the compassion of the man that caused Jesus to marvel. It wasn't the love of the man that caused Jesus to marvel. It was the faith of the man that caused Jesus to marvel. Jesus will never be impressed with our compassion or with our love until we have first trusted in him. And then there is an impression. Then there is joy. It's only your faith that is going to save you from the wrath of God. So don't put hope in what you're doing. Put your hope and your faith in Jesus, his death and his resurrection. Let's pray.